Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Cunningham. I'm Executive Director of Oxford University's North American office based in New York. I'm speaking to you today from my home on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. My colleagues join me in saying that wherever you may be today, we hope that you and your loved ones are well and that you remain safe and healthy during these challenging times. Working for a 900-year-old university has given me a deep appreciation of history. Like many people, though, I wonder why some names come down through the ages and remain known to us in modern times, while others are lost in obscurity. Given what's happened in the world over the last 9 months or so, I suspect that a name will reemerge that has been in obscurity for some time. That name is Edward Jenner. As some of you may know, Edward Jenner invented the vaccine. He was a British scientist and medical practitioner working in England in the late 1700s. In 1796, Jenner discovered the vaccine and also did important research to understand how and why it worked. Shortly thereafter, the Spanish government sponsored an expedition that traveled to the Americas, to China, and the Philippines, inoculating, or I should say vaccinating, thousands of people. And that stretched from 1803 to 1806. Jenner was delighted that this happened, so much so that he wrote, I don't imagine the annals of history furnish an example of philanthropy so noble, so extensive as this. Happily, Jenner would go on to receive an honorary degree from the University of Oxford. Even more importantly, perhaps, Jenner's work since the year 2005 has been carried on in the University of Oxford through the Jenner Institute. The Jenner Institute seeks to develop innovative vaccines for a wide variety of diseases. But to be frank, it's been operating somewhat in obscurity for many years, of course, until now. Under the leadership of Professor Adrian Hill and the important work of other researchers, the Vaccine Center has developed a promising vaccine for COVID-19, led by the work of Professor Sarah Gilbert and others. The vaccine, of course, then faced the important challenge of clinical trials. And so we are especially pleased today to have with us Professor Andrew Pollard, who is the director of the Oxford Vaccine Group at the University of Oxford. He is the designer of Oxford's global vaccine trials and also a professor of pediatrics and infection and immunity within the Nuffield Department of Medicine. He is also a fellow of St. Cross College. And he will be speaking today, we are pleased to say, with the person who I consider the leading journalist of his generation, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. A graduate of Harvard College, where he was Phi Beta Kappa, Nick went on to receive a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Oxford, where he read law as a member of Magdalen College. He and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, were awarded the Pulitzer-Prize for reporting in 1990 based on their coverage of the pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square. He was also awarded a Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2006 based on his work as a columnist for the New York Times. For over 30 years, Nick has traveled the world and written extensively on a wide variety of topics, including global health and the inequalities of healthcare around the world. His latest book, also written with his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, is entitled Tightrope: Americans Reaching for Hope. Our format today will be for Nick and Andy to speak for about 40 minutes or so. Nick will keep an eye on the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. So if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A feature. And later in the program, Nick will do his best to select the most compelling and interesting questions to discuss with Professor Pollard. But without further ado, I'm pleased to be able to turn the proceedings over to Nicholas Kristof.
Hi, thank you so much, Michael. And Andy, welcome to this conversation. We thank you for joining us, and we thank you also for what you're doing to make this a better place and a safer place for all of us.
Thanks very much. I'm very pleased to be here indeed.
And you are actually now physically in Oxford, I believe. So either make us jealous by saying that it's a glorious fall day, or or make us remember those grim rainy days of Oxford. Which is it?
Well, it's actually not been a bad day today. It's unfortunately now 6 p.m. In October, so it's getting a bit dark, but it's certainly not raining today. And we've had a bit of sun this afternoon. And of course, as you know, the sun always shines here.
Absolutely. Well, say hi to the Maudlin deer for me, please. So tell us a little where the vaccine that your group is producing is now in phase 3 trials in a number of countries. How are those going? They were suspended and then resumed outside the U.S. Are they? How do they look?
Well, I mean, things are going incredibly well at pace. We have here in the UK around about 11,000 people in the trials from the phase 1 all the way through to the phase 3. And at the moment, we're in the UK monitoring the volunteers for infection, because the really important bit of this trial in phase 3 is to work out how many people get disease when you compare the group who've had this new vaccine compared with the controls. And obviously a successful vaccine will prevent most or all of the cases, and the controlled vaccine, which doesn't protect against COVID-19, shouldn't prevent any cases. And it's been relatively quiet since we started vaccinating, because we had a national lockdown and a real suppression of cases. But I think, unfortunately, from a public health point of view, we're seeing a big rise in cases at the moment as we approach the autumn months. And so we would anticipate seeing an accumulation of cases in the trial over the next few months. And we also have a trial site in Brazil, and there we have about 6,000 people enrolled already, and we're aiming to get to 10,000 over the next few weeks. And thirdly, in South Africa, where we've enrolled 2,000 people in trials there. So lots of work going on to run the trials, look after all the participants, and to manage this international collaboration.
And if all goes well with the trials, then what's the timetable? When will we actually see people beginning to get jabbed?
Well, I was hoping you could answer that question. So the problem is that we're entirely at the mercy of the pandemic. So we have to accumulate enough cases in the trials for the regulators to be comfortable that when we try and look at the statistics of this difference between the two groups in the trials, that there is enough confidence that if the vaccine does indeed work, that the estimates that we're giving are true. And so for that to occur, we need to accumulate cases in the trials. And of course, that depends on what happens next. We are just seeing this big rise in the UK, and with 10,000 people, we should be able to get there potentially even this year. But it's an unknown quantity, because we don't know either what the virus will do, or of course what governments will do in trying to contain spread, which is great for public health, but does make it harder to evaluate the impact of the vaccine.
And so then if all goes well and this is available in some quantity, say early in the year, then what quantities actually will be available, and who gets vaccinated, and who decides who gets vaccinated?
So our aim has always been to try to have equitable access globally. And so there's two aspects to that. The first thing is we designed trials that were covered different sites around the world, so we could show that the vaccine works in these different populations. And that's very important, whether you're in Latin America, Africa, Asia, or here in the UK. And so part of the program has involved an out-license deal to Serum Institute of India, so that we have Asian trials as well. And obviously the partnership with AstraZeneca means there's trials not only in Europe, but with you in North America as well. And so the first bit is that we should be able to have data from many countries around the world to help inform that information. The next I guess, component of your question is, if the vaccine works, what happens next? And the next step actually is for regulators to scrutinize the data carefully so that they can approve the vaccine for use. And because we're in this sort of unprecedented situation of the pandemic, it's likely that regulators will give some conditional approval initially for any of these vaccines that are in development, so that we're in a position to start to roll out vaccination in the different countries around the world to protect people, but while still gathering more data to inform whether, for example, all other populations, so children, perhaps pregnant women, other groups who won't have been studied in the early studies can be looked at to see whether broader use in the population is acceptable. So the initial license might not cover everything. And then you're absolutely right. The question next is who decides? And in most countries, there are policymakers who are independent experts. In the US, you have ACIP, the American Committee on Immunization Practice, who give advice that is then usually taken up by governments in funding programs and so on. I don't know quite in the US how that process will work. Here in the UK, we have an independent committee that advises government. And what they've said so far is, without knowing the characteristics of the vaccine, the primary groups that would be targeted would be the elderly and those with health conditions. If there's enough supply, then it would move to healthcare workers after that, before looking more widely in the population and targeting particularly older adults. And of course, that policy is going to be slightly different in different countries around the world, depending on the types of populations and what the vulnerable groups are.
Here in the US, I think there are a lot of people, some in the White House, who see the vaccine as kind of a silver bullet, and that this, once it arrives, okay, then problems are over. And so walk us through that. I mean, the FDA here says that it will approve a vaccine simply if it has 50% efficacy, which, frankly, doesn't sound as exciting as we might hope for. And so what kind of efficacy should we expect in practice, especially in the early months? And what about, even if a vaccine is safe, quote unquote, then presumably there may be complications for some small number of people, as there have been for other vaccines historically. So to what extent are there clouds that we should expect both on the safety side and the efficacy side?
Well, the FDA, I think, have done the right thing in that they have set a lower bar of what they would accept. So they would license a vaccine as long as it was at least 50%. That doesn't mean that that's what they're aiming for. I think the FDA would like a vaccine which is much more effective, but what they don't want to do is to throw out a vaccine which could stop half of the deaths in the US. And so I think that they've taken quite a sensible approach in trying to work out what the minimum is. And it's actually much harder to demonstrate that a vaccine is 50% efficacious. So if a vaccine did have low efficacy, it's going to take longer to get there to be able to prove it. And that's just a statistical requirement. If it's a very effective vaccine, then we may get there earlier in some of the interim looks of the data that there will be in the clinical trials. To make that assessment. So of course we hope for a vaccine that's very effective, but at the moment we only have, across all of the vaccines that are being that are at advanced stage of development, an idea about the immune response, but we still don't have any idea in humans how much of that response you actually need for protection.
And on the safety side, there's been polling here in the US that suggests that there's some vaccine hesitancy, partly because of the pace at which this has proceeded. And I think the previous record for a vaccine was something like 4 years or 5 years for mumps. Now this is obviously going to be, any of these vaccines is going to be much, much faster. What do you say to somebody who says, look, I want to be protected, but boy, this has been going fast. The politics seems to have interfered with the process here in the US. What reassurance do you offer?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that absolutely my duty as a chief investigator of our trials is about safety. We're trying to evaluate whether this vaccine is safe and whether it works, but safe is the first component of that. And that's why we have this very complicated process, which is very heavily regulated. It's not really very different around the world. Every possible event that happens to the nearly 20,000 people we have in trials at the moment is recorded. Anything that's medically significant or anyone admitted to hospital has to be reported within 24 hours to us here in Oxford as the sponsor. And then we provide reports to an independent committee and also to the regulator in the UK. And that process means that we pick up absolutely everything that's happening. And of course, a lot of it is just those things which happen day to day. People get run over by a car, or they have a heart attack, because we've got many elderly people in the trials. So those sorts of events are going to be picked up all the time. But what we're looking for is any signal to see whether it's more common in one group or the other in the studies, so that we can pick up even relatively rare things. I think from a safety perspective, although many vaccines will take 5 or 10 years for development, licensure usually doesn't require as many people as we actually have in these trials already. So in terms of total numbers of people, you may only have 5,000 or so people in many trials. We've already got 20,000 in our trials, another 30,000 planned in the AstraZeneca trial in the US. The safety databases are going to be much larger than there will be in most other vaccine studies that have ever been done. So I think from that perspective, there's some reassurance. But you're absolutely right that there is always this question of, well, what about longer term side effects? And of course, you can't address that one head on, because we have only been in this game since the 23rd of April. And I can't tell you whether anything unexpected would happen in a year's time. However, in the way that the immune system works and what we know from previous vaccines, most of the types of adverse events that happen relatively soon after immunization. And obviously, we've already got many people who have had months since they've had their first dose. And so we have quite a lot of the early data. The second thing to say is that if things are very, very rare, happening 1 in a million people or 1 in several million, you can't find that out, even if you wait 10 years with your trials of 5,000 people. So time is part of the equation, and it's an important part, but also the numbers of people. The numbers have to add up. If you've got very rare events, you're not going to pick them up in small trials, and certainly not even in trials of 20,000 people.
And I think your vaccine requires 2 doses, two vaccinations. How do we stand in terms of rolling out supplies, not only of the vaccine, but I mean, I believe that there are shortages of vaccine glass, and that just logistics of getting that many vaccinations out. What kind of, if all goes pretty well on the vaccine front, when would it be that, that most people would actually be able to get vaccinated, and that we would be having this conference in person?
Yes, so I mean, I think it really comes to the question you were asking before about when does life get back to normal, and it is a challenging one, because even if we had enough vaccine supply for everyone today, there's a huge logistical challenge of rolling it out. And also, we don't fully know what policymakers are going to say about who should get it first. And so I think it's unlikely, in my view, that we're going to very rapidly be in a position where all physical distancing measures can be just dropped. Because until we've got a high level of immunity in the population so that we can stop the virus in its tracks, either because we block transmission or because the majority of people are immune, and certainly everyone vulnerable is immune, then until we reach that point, there is going to be a risk. This is a highly transmissible virus that will still be able to move from person to person, and where those vulnerable people still are around in the population who are not immune, they will remain at risk. So I can't give you a timescale, but I don't think it's going to be soon. Even if we've got vaccine and we're rolling it out tomorrow, I don't see until well into next year that we could be in a position where we're comfortable to give up and for everyone to be meeting in person.
So we're unlikely, say, at least for the first half of 2021, to be having conferences in person, say.
I think that's my view. If we have a vaccine and can roll it out around the world rapidly, we can't give it to 7 billion people in the first 6 months of next year, even if we had that number of doses, which we won't have.
And, speaking of 7 billion people, so obviously a disease like this tends to encourage vaccine nationalism. And we've seen a lot of public spirited efforts to create global, create this global public health good. But national leaders, including in this country, have resisted and have wanted to emphasize getting everybody in their own country vaccinated. How do you, as a public health expert, how do you see that trade-off? What benefits the country itself? Are we as Americans, narrowly speaking, better off just vaccinating Americans, or do we actually benefit to some degree from vaccinating people in other countries as well?
It's a good question. Perhaps the politics I'll leave to you to address. But I think one of the approaches we took from Oxford University's perspective was we have this sort of global view that number one, we have a duty not just to the UK, but to the global village that we live in. And so when we were seeking a partner to help with the supply and distribution of vaccine, we partnered with AstraZeneca because they had that shared vision. And part of that is to make sure that the supply chain is not at risk of nationalism. And so that means that we have, within that partnership, manufacturing that covers all the different regions around the world to ensure that that supply is not interrupted by decisions that are made in Europe or in the US. That doesn't stop us from supplying in India. And that, I think that is a critical part of how that we've set this up. I think you're absolutely right that it would be unfortunate and perhaps narrow-minded to focus just on a nationalistic approach, because it is unlikely that everyone in a population will take the vaccine. You mentioned vaccine hesitancy. There will also be some people who have a compromised immune system and can't be vaccinated in our populations, and some people who, for whatever reason, just don't turn up to be vaccinated. So we will remain at risk if people elsewhere in the world are not protected, because we will need to open up travel and people moving between different economies, and that will leave us all at risk. And public health is something which is relevant internally in a country, but health security is a critical part of that external interaction that we have with the rest of the world. And health security means that other people need to be protected as well.
This may test our scientific literacy, including mine, but can you explain to some degree what distinguishes the Oxford vaccine from the other vaccines that are out there that are being tested too?
Well, there are a number of different technologies being tested, and our technology is not so different from some of the other vaccines. So there's a Chinese vaccine that's very similar to ours, there's a Russian vaccine that's very similar, and there's one from Johnson & Johnson, an American company, which is also very similar. And what the approach we're taking is that we've taken a common cold virus, and in fact the one we've got is one that naturally infects chimpanzees. It's a chimpanzee common cold virus, and it's been weakened so that it is completely harmless to humans. In fact, it can't even divide and make new viruses in humans. And that virus is used to take the genetic code from part of coronavirus into the vaccine, and that then allows our immune system to fight coronavirus. So it's a clever way of transporting a bit of the coronavirus gene into the vaccine and allow us to make protection in our bodies against coronaviruses.
And what we talked about efficacy earlier, but what about the duration? What is the time period that one would, do we expect this would fade in terms of efficacy after some number of months, for example? Is there concern about that?
Well, it's the right question, and it's clear that we've seen some decline in antibody after infection. So that's the one part of the immune response declines after infection over about 3 months in some people. With the vaccines so far, we have relatively little information about how long immunity lasts. And that's just simply a time factor. We'll have more information in time. We're about to get blood samples at some of our volunteers 6 months after they were vaccinated. So that will tell us about whether it lasts for 6 months or not. But for those earlier time points, we've seen quite good responses so far. But that's very short term. That's in the first month or so. So I think that the first signal we'll have on how long immunity lasts will be after some time has passed, unfortunately. We do have a bit of a handle on this because the Ebola vaccines, which have been licensed, both of those that are licensed actually use the same type of technology, viral vectors, and they both showed responses that were still there a year later. So there may be some hope, but I'm a scientist, and so you need to actually do the testing to find out the answer to the question.
And so it looks as if in the spring, there may be a number of different vaccines that have been approved. Some of those have been tested not exactly against each other, but at least within the same framework. Pfizer is outside that framework with its vaccine. So what happens if say in March, I go to my doctor's office and he says, okay, you can have any one of these 4 vaccines. How does a consumer determine what vaccine to get?
I think so far what we know is that all of the vaccines that have been tested in the, or at least the responses to them tested in the laboratory and published, all of them are making the right sort of immune responses. And when I say the right sort, what I mean is the sort that in the animal studies provided protection in animals against infection, or at least disease, I should say, not always against infection, but against severe disease. And so with the information we have today, we couldn't really decide which of those vaccines is the right or the wrong one. They all look as if they're doing the same sort of thing. It probably is only going to be later on when we have evidence about what the threshold is that you need for protection and whether there are any differences between the vaccines that we can really answer that question. And one of the real challenges here is that the testing is being done so far in different laboratories around the world. So you can't even compare a response to one vaccine with a response to another because we don't have a centralized laboratory. That is something which is being worked on both for the world by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization, and also in the US by Operation Warp Speed. But that is not up and running yet. We don't have those head-to-head comparisons for the vaccines.
The vaccines, again, as a complete layman, the vaccines seem really promising to me, but also kind of uncertain. And you know, having followed the AIDS vaccine for a couple of decades now, you know, I guess I wonder about that uncertainty. Well, we're also seeing real progress in therapies, and you know, monoclonal antibodies, for example, seem really promising, and just routine treatments seem, convalescent plasma seems promising as well. I wonder, you know, to what extent you think that we will end up licking the virus in the end, not just with a vaccine, but just through through better behaviors, through masking, through better treatments, and then on top of that, with you know, several vaccines that are efficacious.
Well, I think if we end up with a situation where we have vaccines which effectively prevent disease, and of course this is what we're all trying to establish at the moment, whether that is true, but if we make an assumption that that's true, that is by far the best way to control the virus, because what we want is for people not to get sick and go into hospital and be treated. We want something that could be rolled out on a large scale that completely prevent that from happening. There isn't, I agree with your concerns given the difficulties with HIV vaccines. Fortunately, coronavirus is a very different animal. it's a virus where we really ought to be able to contain it with a vaccine. And certainly the evidence so far is that the type of antibodies that are made in response to the vaccines are able, in the laboratory, to stop the virus in its tracks. So if that translates into the reality in the efficacy trials, I think we'll be over the line with that. There's absolutely no doubt that, given my comments about the medium term, where we will still need to have new treatments to try and manage people who do get sick. Sadly, though, I don't think that those treatments will always be available to everyone in the world who needs them and given early enough to ensure that people are protected and survive. And one of the great things about vaccines is that there is a supply system around the world to be able to provide them, because we've had, particularly for childhood immunization, we've had those supply chains available for many decades now. And so that is a system that's in place. What we don't have in every corner of the world is hospitals that can afford expensive treatments that could be used, and indeed many parts of the world where there are no facilities and hospitals to treat people. So I think if we take a global view, treatment could be really important in rich countries in the short term, but I don't think we're going to be able to get the penetration of them to every corner of the world where people need to be protected.
And when the first people begin to get vaccinated, presumably probably healthcare workers, for example, maybe in January, for example, if everything works well, then will you encourage them to continue to wear masks, for example?
Well, I think in the short term, we are almost certainly going to be in a situation where there are still vulnerable people in the population and not everyone's vaccinated. So I think we're going to initially be in a position where mask wearing and social distancing doesn't change. It won't be until we see a drop in cases and severe cases particularly that I think governments are going to be comfortable to relax those measures.
One of my just great frustrations in covering public health, and I'm sure it's even more one of yours as somebody who's in the middle of it, has been resistance to vaccines generally around the world. And, I go to, Pakistan and see people risking their lives to vaccinate against polio. And then here in the United States, I see people who won't vaccinate their kids, risking not only their own kids, but those kids' classmates. And I guess one of my real concerns is that there will be at least perceptions among some people in the US and in other countries that safety has been compromised by speed and by the political calculations of leaders, and that even if that isn't true, that will cast to some degree a shadow over vaccines generally in ways that will give a boost to this vaccine hesitancy that I think is just so unfortunate. I wondered whether you have any of that concern as well.
Yeah, I'd certainly share the concern. I mean, the vaccine confidence is a major issue, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's been a major issue for some time, and it is I think a real difficult problem for us in public health. And as I mentioned, I work particularly with children, and we've seen a long period of time globally where diseases like measles were falling every year. And then in 2019, the number of measles cases rose for the first time in more than a decade globally. And that was because of reductions in vaccination around the world, and here in Europe as well as in the US. And of course, the knock-on effect of that is children died here in Europe and in the US as a result. And yet that still doesn't seem to have reached the level where the populations retain or regain their confidence in vaccination. So I think we still have a lot of work to do to both explain the importance for health of vaccination, but also to allay the safety concerns that people have that are very real. And I think we haven't got that right still. We think at the moment, each year, about 3 million children don't die because they're being vaccinated, and they would have died anyway. And when you add that up over decades, that is a vast number of people who are protected. And you mentioned people risking their lives to vaccinate. And that's because people who are on the front line of this, who are seeing these severe cases like the polio ones that you're talking about, are absolutely passionate about vaccination because they see the huge benefits of it. But I think in many societies where we have an expectation of health for our children, it seems unnecessary to vaccinate. Most people don't know of a family where a child has died. Go back 100 years, most families would have had a child who died. And that's one of the big changes that public health has made, and part of that is through vaccination. I think you're right to raise the issue of where we are at the moment in this febrile atmosphere, particularly with the media scrutiny of every step that's being taken in the trials. It really does risk public confidence. And it isn't really the responsibility of the media to get it right, but it's difficult to know how we do get it right. We're in a very heavily regulated environment that does ensure safety of participants in trials. Which means that things like the pauses in our trials are actually good news. This is because we have incredible scrutiny of safety, and we look at every unexplained illness, we have independent reviews, and then an independent regulator review before we restart to make sure that there isn't any risk. And we heard today that the Johnson & Johnson trials had been paused as well. And that shows that they also have very strict protocols that mean that they will look carefully at every case. And that is exactly how it should be. Unfortunately, that has been portrayed in the media internationally as a safety concern rather than actually a reason not to be concerned about safety. And I think we've got, I think, a lot of work to do to get that communication correct. In the end, I think this is a much bigger issue than just vaccines. This is about confidence in science. And we've had huge problems with communication around science over many years. And it seems that here in the middle of the pandemic is the one point at which you really need science to be your friend. And we're struggling again. I hope that we'll have successful vaccines that help end this pandemic and the new treatments that have been developed in hospitals, and that will perhaps do something as a legacy for this pandemic to perhaps maybe persuade people that that science actually does make a difference in our lives.
Well, thank you for your leadership on that and that of your colleagues. I'm going to call on or read some questions that people have been posting in the Q&A. Thank you for all of them. There are a bunch of really good questions. And
I'm just going to step back and turn a light on because it got very dark in here whilst you were talking. Hold on.
Results from the trials, the phase 3 trials. Stephen Allis asks, when will we find out the interim results of the current stage?
Well, if the interim results show that the vaccine works, then those will be published and they will result in license submissions. And that will be true for all of the vaccine developers that if you have a strong result early that meets the statistical criteria for a regulator, then those results will become public knowledge.
And Stephen Potts asks a variant of something that I'd raised, this notion that there may be several safe and effective vaccines competing in the spring. And so, either for an individual or for doctors, for example, who are watching, what guidance can you offer about which they should provide patients or which we as patients should turn to? How do we make that judgment?
Well, I think the information that we would have at that time, so that means a regulator has approved it. So there might be some different characteristics. So for example, some vaccines might work better in the elderly than others. And that would be based on looking at the immune responses. So the label that is then put on that vaccine would describe which populations it can be used in. The other thing is there may be a different side effect profile. So most of the vaccines development give you a sore arm and make you feel a bit unwell in the first 24 hours. So a bit virally just because of the way that it soups up your immune system to get a good immune response. And so it might be that some individuals will tolerate some vaccines less well than others. And that profile of different vaccines will be understood at that point. So I think there might be some additional guidance that comes from regulators about how they should be used.
Nick Payne asks a question about in a sense, the population benefits, that while the phase 3 trials are about the benefit to the individual, there presumably also is a larger benefit to the population that the trial doesn't really acknowledge. And he asks, do we need some new experimental designs that actually look at the benefit to the population?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. One is the science of the vaccines, which is, can the vaccine prevent transmission? And in our study in the UK, we are actually directly addressing that by taking 10,000 swabs every week from everyone in the trial to assess whether or not even asymptomatic infections can be blocked by the vaccine. And clearly, if you can stop even the asymptomatic infections from occurring, you could have interrupt transmission completely. So that would have a wider benefit to the population and generate herd immunity. I don't think that's an absolute requirement for a vaccine. If vaccines can prevent disease and death, that's good enough for me. But even better if they can also interrupt transmission in that way. And we do have designs that will do that. But there's a separate question, which is the wider benefits for society. If we can open up economies as a result of protecting the elderly, which is, I guess, perhaps the biggest issue in most countries, and those with health conditions, then that transforms the health of populations if we get global economic growth again and get things jump-started. I think that really does make a huge difference to the population at large.
Jenna Orkin asks about mutation of the virus and how that might affect the vaccine. Is it possible to anticipate how the virus might mutate, and could the vaccine be engineered to accommodate those mutations?
So this virus is an RNA virus, and that's the genetic material it uses. And RNA viruses tend to make lots of mistakes when they're making new viruses. So mutation will be happening. We know it is happening as this virus spreads. So far, I haven't seen any strong evidence that the mutations are occurring in the bit of the spike protein that's being used in most of the vaccines. And of course, that may change once we have a lot of people vaccinated, because it won't be good for the virus if it stays the same and can no longer spread. So we could have a situation where immunity in the population helps drive some mutation in the virus. And so that could be a reason in the future for making new variations of vaccines that are able to work against new variants of the virus. And of course, we do that every year with influenza, where the flu, another RNA virus, changes a bit every year, and so we have to keep making new vaccines. So I think if that does turn out to be a phenomenon with coronavirus, we do have strategies that could be used to manage that going forwards.
We have a number of people asking basically for some early results. So just between us, Anita Sinclair asks, of the 20,000 people who've been vaccinated, have any of them actually caught COVID?
Well, the first thing to say is I'm blinded to the results, just so that I can't answer questions like this when they come up. We've got 20,000 people around the world in a pandemic, so there are cases, because until we reach the point where we have enough cases, we're not going to look at that. And that's only being looked at by our unblinded safety monitoring committee and the statisticians who work with them. And they will at some point say to me that we need to do a formal analysis.
There are several questions about the partnership with AstraZeneca, and I think in some of those questions, not all of them, there's a kind of a suspicion of corporations, of monetization, of what may of how things are actually implemented from the research side. And so I wonder, how scholars see that partnership, that kind of partnership.
Well, I think a critical component of the partnership with AstraZeneca for us was the not-for-profit nature of the partnership in the pandemic, which is pretty exceptional. That's not the case for most developers. And I think because AstraZeneca shared that vision that this had to be a vaccine for the world, then I think we felt we could partner with them. And so in the pandemic period, that is absolutely the intent, is to supply as much of the world as possible in a not-for-profit way. But the partnership arrangements with them, I think, are exactly where we wanted to land. And obviously in the long run, will be AstraZeneca's vaccine for the future.
Dina Gregory asks a question about the long haulers, those people who have survived but have had a long-term impact from it. And do we have a sense of whether, you know, the vaccines will not only save lives but, you know, also either may help people who already have been infected and have suffered the long hauler syndrome, or can at least, you know, mitigate those kind of problems looking forward?
If the vaccines work and they prevent disease, I think we would anticipate they would also prevent this long COVID syndrome that's being described. But you know, until we have the efficacy results, it's slightly difficult to formally answer that question.
We've got, again, kind of questions on timetables, which everybody kind of wants to know. But you talked about early in the year if all goes well, but presumably that will initially be limited for some time. So in terms of when a member of the general public might actually get that jab, what, you know, those of us watching, when should we think about making that appointment?
We are doing everything we can to get there as soon as possible, because really we set out on this journey because we want to have an impact if the vaccine works on this health crisis.
Well, Andy, we want to thank you for joining us in this really enlightening conversation. But even more than that, we just want to thank you for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. I'm sure it's pretty much round the clock, and we're all rooting for you in every possible way, and we appreciate the work the Institute is doing. So thank you very much on behalf of all of us, and I'm going to turn things over to Michael again.
Thanks very much, and thanks for listening.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick and Andy. One of the downsides of this format, again, is that we can't applaud, so I will applaud for the almost 700 people who have been online joining us today. And unfortunately, we still have 99 questions in the Q&A, so it shows how interested people have been in this topic. And so, again, we're very grateful to both Nicholas Kristof and Professor Andrew Pollard for joining us today. I'd be remiss if I didn't note, as in my role as a fundraiser, that there has been a great groundswell of support from our alumni and friends in connection to the work that the university is doing related to COVID-19. Some of the funding, of course, for the vaccine has come from AstraZeneca, but there's a large component of philanthropic need related to Oxford's work in COVID-19. One particularly heartwarming story, my colleagues and I received a gift of $36 from a middle school for children with special needs who had taken up a collection at lunchtime and wanted to be part of Oxford's work on COVID-19. And so, so if you would like to be part of Oxford's work on COVID-19, there will be a slide put on in just a moment at the end of this presentation. It'll provide information on how to reach out to Professor Pollard's team in terms of getting more information, but also we'll share information if you'd like to be supportive philanthropically of Oxford's work in this area. We have been able to create 2 new endowed chairs related to this work. We'd love to have a 3rd one. So in particular, if you'd like to learn more information about that, you can contact either myself or my colleague, Sally Benner, whose contact information will also be on that slide, in addition to our slide about the North American office. Finally, our next webinar is on Thursday, celebrating 100 years of women receiving degrees or being eligible to receive degrees at Oxford, and that'll be Thursday at 1 o'clock. So we hope you'll join us for that as well. But that, again, I'd like to sincerely thank Professor Andrew Pollard and Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times for joining us today, and to say that we hope you all remain healthy and safe again during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us.